Hello everyone, it is the Night Shadow again. Welcome back to part 3 of Flow series. We're going to be talking about the grid today. What is the grid? How do we use the grid? How do we move around the grid? What is the important points to remember when working with the grid? We'll go all over that in this video. So if nobody has explained the grid to you, or like grid theory, and you're starting to pick up gloving, you're starting to pick up on all the moves and expand your inventory of gloving concepts, stuff like that. All good fun, all great job at that. But there's certain things that you want to take into account when you're starting to learn these moves and how to use these moves properly, right? And we're going to be talking about the grid, and the grid is very important because you're playing, with light trails, you're playing with perceptions, you're playing with a lot of things. You're playing with illusions, right? You wanna give that illusion sometimes that like a point is fixed in space, and like you're moving around that point, right? Like it's an imaginary point that you can't really see, and you have to kind of be aware of that when you start gloving and when you start giving shows, so you can have awareness of the space around you, what you can work with, where you can go, how you can move there in a smooth way, right? Because you want your show to be smooth and clean, and having that grid mentality helps you. Even if your moves aren't that great, if you have good grid theory, good grid mentality, you can still pull off some great moves without having some complicated tech or finger tutting or something like that. Like you can still make it good as long as you have that concept and you're working with that concept at the beginning. That way, you can actually learn your moves and know how to, use them in tandem with each other, and how to transition and what you want to be focusing on, right? So when I first started gloving, I didn't really know about any grid theory, anything like that. So I think I was like at an event. I think it was like a camping event or something like that. I brought my gloves. I had only started gloving for like a couple of weeks, I think. And I was just, let me just whip them out and see what I can do. So I was, giving light shows to people. Probably wasn't that great, but then a guy, came up to me. He's like, hey, your show is great and all like that, but you want to think about the grid, right? You want to be rotating your gestures. You want to be, tracing around it, flip it, rotate it. And I was like, oh, okay, this all sounds good and cool, but what is the grid? And then he kind of explained it to me, and I was like, oh man, that kind of makes so much more sense. And ever since then, I've been consciously using that grid mentality, that grid theory. So what is the grid, and how do we really use it? Well, you got to think about the space that you're giving your show to. It really depends. Like if you're filming a light show, or if you're actually giving it in real life. Because in real life, when there's no like cameras that you're really focused on, you have like a lot more room to work with, right? Because a camera can only get a certain amount of space, but when you're out in the world, you have plenty of space that you can work with, and the perception can get like better, I would say. So you have to think about the space that you have. You want to be conscious of it. You want to know where you can work with, like forward, backward, side to side, right? So in gloving, you can definitely, let's start with this gesture, right? You can definitely move it up, down, left, right. You can even move it diagonally if you want. You can definitely move around the grid. You can move it forward. You can move it backwards. So you don't have kind of like a 2D grid, right? You're not just working with this space right here. You can actually, move it forward, play with the perception as you move your gestures or your liquid or whatever you're working with, in those dimensions, right? You're working in a 3D dimension, so you want to be aware of that you can't, you can't only just move in a 2D grid. You can actually move it forward. You can be really close if you want, or you can be over here, doing stuff, doing some, I don't know, flails, whips, whatever, but you have to be conscious of what you're doing, and you can't just, be playing over here and then just start doing stuff over there. It's not gonna look right. I'm not telling you, there's certain rules you have to follow, but it can help you with your show to make it look a lot cleaner and give that people that perception that it's a show that actually has fluidity and movement that corresponds to those grid movements, right? So with the grid, you want to be aware of like invisible points, like I mentioned earlier. You want to kind of like set a point in space, like let's say right here. You can move up, you can move down, you can move towards it, you can move around it, but you're kind of not losing track of that point, right? That point is there. Let's say it's fixed. Now you don't necessarily have to be touching that point, but you're aware of where that point is. Like let's say you're doing like this move, right? You're moving around that point. So you have that point in mind and you don't want to lose track of that point. So it can make your moves look a lot cleaner, and that you're actually working with the grid, back and forth. Doesn't mean you have to stay on that point, but that point is there. You can also move points throughout your show, right? You don't have to be stuck in that middle point, right? You don't have to just stay here. You can definitely, let's say your point was here and then you want to move it over there, right? Like you can move it over here and now your point is there. But let's move it over there again. Like, see? You can definitely move the points. And something that comes with it is like making those movements kind of accentuated, I guess, because you're aware that you're moving the point. And we'll go over finger tutting in future videos as well, so I can teach you how to really move well with finger tutting, because finger tutting gets a little bit complicated, right? Because you're working with right angles, you're working with more rigid movements, right? Then let's say you're working with liquid, right? You're not really stuck to 90-degree angles. You can go back, you can bring it around, right? You can go everywhere you want, but you're still, keeping track of that grid, right? Especially, let's say you're doing like what's this move called? Finger rolls, right? You're doing finger rolls, right? You kind of want to have that go in a straight line, right? You're going in kind of like a pattern, right? You're not just moving it up and down wherever you want. You kind of have like a certain pattern that you're making throughout, right? You can just make it in a straight line. You can, bring it forward and bring it back, bring it forward, bring it back, but you're having that perception of where you're moving it to, right? And that's where I wanted to accentuate, like, you're playing with perception. And in the next video, we'll go over musicality and showmanship, so I can show you better on like how you can throw certain moves, how you can add personality to certain moves. But first you got to learn what the grid is, right? How it works. Let's say like, you have a tutting move, right? Your point is kind of like fixed right there. You can definitely move around it, right? That point is not lost. It's just you're moving around that point. You can rotate it, right? Do the same thing. You can definitely move one hand, then move the other, but you're still keeping the center of attention in that point. So you're playing with those invisible points fixed where it's fixed in the x-axis and the y-axis and the z-axis, right? You're playing with perception as well, so you got to keep track of that point where it is in that distance. And that's especially important, like I said, in finger tutting and tutting. You'll definitely get more acquainted with that, because you want your angles to be, straight, and you're giving that perception that these hands can't really move just freely. You're working with a certain type of move that you can do, and you want to be aware of those invisible points that are isolated, right? Let's say like my point is isolated here, so I can go right there. I can definitely go right here. You're working around that point. Another thing that comes with the grid is definitely symmetry, right? How we talked about sacred geometry and we talked about flow, and definitely you can work with symmetry using the grid, right? Because our brains like symmetrical patterns. It's not going to look the same as when you're doing this or this, then symmetrical movements. Something you can explore to gain more gestures, I guess, of this kind is like finger stylists. Finger stylists work with like intricate hand movements like this. You can't really do them too much in gloving. Like, let's say, hold on, I kind of forgot how to do like this move, but let's say you have like this formation, right? Like you're doing the same thing on the left hand and on the right hand, and you can definitely use the grid to like isolate certain points, right? Let's say you want to isolate towards your index fingers, right? You still have the symmetry, and then you can just work around it, right? You can open it up, you can close it back again, you can bring one forward, one back. You still have that same structure, right? And you're working around it in a symmetrical way. So I don't hear that too much in like the gloving scene. I don't see too many videos talking about that symmetry, that mirroring, that you want to, you can even cross your hands and do stuff, but you're doing the same thing with one hand that you're doing in the other. So you want to work on that symmetry as well, because our brain perceives symmetrical patterns, right? And it likes symmetrical patterns. Like I said, you can do it even with whips, right? Or with flails, right? You're going in a certain pattern. You're picking points around the grid that you're working with. This is why I like kind of like gloving in person better, because like I said, like you have much more range of movements. See how like I did that and that went off frame because videotaping this. I'm not really doing it in person. But in person you have so much more room. Your grid is much higher than when you do a video. You have to be aware of that. So now that you have that fixed in your mind, you want to kind of like practice going from point to point, right? How many ways are there to move around those points? How do I move smoothly around those points? How many ways are there to move around those points? And that comes with your own imagination. The only thing you really have to keep in mind is you want to make it fluid. You want to make it flow, right? Like we talked about flow. You want to make it all connect, right? You don't have to stay at a certain point. You can be moving around points all you want, but you're aware that you're moving through those points, right? You're aware of what point you're working around. Once you have that grid mentality that you have to move something around it, you can definitely have like this structure and just move it around if you want. Like you can be starting over here and then move that structure over here, move it up, move it down. You don't necessarily have to like do a tricky move to move somewhere. You don't have to trace or wave tut towards something to make it move. You know, I have the structure right there. I can just move it over here, right? And then, be working with it. And that comes with knowing the concepts. The thing is, you want to be aware of those points, because those points will make your show look a lot cleaner, and your perceptions is going to, the perception that your viewer is seeing, will definitely be accentuated because you're working around those points, and they'll definitely see that you have mastery over that grid theory. Not many people getting into gloving talk about the grid, but the grid is very important, especially if you're trying to learn how to move around it. So like I said, you don't have to be pointing at a certain point, right? Like, let's say this point is fixed right here. You can move all around it all you want. However, you can definitely use that symmetry I was talking about and move it around. It doesn't really have to be connected all the time, but you're still using that grid mentality. You're using that symmetry. Like, let's say, for example, I have a point right here and a point right there. And let's say, you want to use that grid theory. So let's say, like, imagine there's like an imaginary stick, right? There's an imaginary stick between these 2 points, So what can you do with it? You can definitely move it around, right? You're aware of the distance that imaginary stick is. You can bring it down, you can bring it up. But you're using that kind of like imaginary line that they're connected somehow. They're moving in tandem with each other. You can make the stick shorter, you can move around it. But when you're using that symmetry, right, especially if you're moving both hands at the same time, and we'll get to like finger tutting and tracing and stuff like that, because sometimes you want to use both your hands, right, to move, and sometimes you just want to be moving one at a time, depending on what concept you really want to go with. But like I said, if you have those imaginary 2 points and you just move around it, right, I'm not doing anything complicated. I'm just moving around the grid symmetrically, like they're connected. And you can definitely use all sorts of ways to move around the grid. Like I said, you don't have to be connected to that. You can definitely bring it all the way over, right? Like, the point is still there. You can be working something over here, then switch to this hand goes do some flails, but that point is still there, right? I haven't really moved it or shifted it. And like I said, when you're working with symmetry, you're working with perception, you kind of want to use that imaginary line sometimes to make some intricate moves, right? You're moving around it and you're connecting it later on. You know what I mean? It's kind of complicated when you just talk about it, but when you start doing it and you see those patterns that you want to exemplify. Like I said, you're using symmetry and you're using the grid. You're using that same level. You're using the same plane to make your moves. Like I said, just be aware of those points stuck in space, and it will make your show look a lot smoother. So I think that's as in depth as I wanted to go to the grid. Like I said, speaking about it helps, but definitely to get good at moving around the grid and knowing your grid is practice, right? You have to be practicing. Just practice around, right? Just like make a point and see what you can do around it. See how many ways there is to move around that point. And see then how you can just shift to other points, in smooth motions. Like I said, you don't have to be doing something tricky. You can just move it. But you're consciously aware that you're moving your grid. You're moving around the grid. You're moving around your points. So hopefully that helps you out with definitely your tech, your movements. Like I said, even if you're throwing whips, right, you're aware of the grid. You're aware of what points you're supposed to be concentrating on, right? Like I said, I'm not doing anything complicated right here. I'm just opening and closing my hands. But I'm using that perception to go around in a symmetrical way and using that direct line where I'm working towards, right? And like I said, you'll have to practice these moves to get them as smooth as possible, but you have that mentality, you have that step, right? You have that step that you're working around, and you know where your point is, and you know that you can shift around it, you can move through it. Even doesn't have to be stuck in there. You don't have to just be pointing at it, but the point is there and you're working around that, right? You can be doing flails around it, you can be doing liquid around it, you can be doing all sorts of things, but that comes with skill, right? That comes with practice, that comes with knowing concepts. But as soon as you have that grid mentality down, something clicks in you and you know how you're supposed to really move around it, what you're supposed to be focusing on, right? So once you have that, it's a very key step to improving your flowing game, your gloving game, your flow artist game overall. And like I said, I really wanted to make this video because there's not a lot of videos doing grid theory. There's like a couple of short videos explaining it very briefly, but I kind of want to give you an example of how to work around it, right? And be aware of where you're moving your hands around, and being aware of those invisible points, where they're at in the x-axis, in the y-axis, and in the z-axis, right? Because you're not just working in a two-dimensional grid, you're working around a three-dimensional grid. Like I said, just be aware of those points and be aware what your space is, where you can work around it. And if you're moving points, that you're aware that you moved your points, right? If you have a point there and then you shift here and then you just shift over there, it doesn't really look smooth, like you're just moving around. But if you're intentionally moving it and then you're just working around it, or you're just intentionally moving it over here and moving it over there, it looks a lot better. It just looks a lot better, and your gloving game is going to go up a lot. So that's why I kind of wanted to make this series overall and make this video about grid theory, because it's not thoroughly explained, and it took me a while to really get it, because it's not a concept that's too talked about, right? Everybody might have talked about grid theory, but they don't really explain it to that depth. So we're 23 minutes in right now, so I think that's as good as I want to explain the grid. Next episode, we're going to be going over showmanship and musicality, right? What ways you can do to add some personality, some ways to spice up your moves. Now that you know about the grid, about flow, about geometry, symmetry, now we can actually start getting into, like cool ways to do your moves, or cool ways to add personality, how to add your own flair to your shows, right? Because there's different ways to move around the grid, right? It doesn't have to be just plain old moves, right? You can do like this, you can slow moves down, you can work here and then move it over there and then bring it back here, right? There's a lot of stuff you can do and add personality and showmanship to that, and that's another key element that I want to talk about, so you can get better in your journey. And then we can actually start getting into concepts. We can actually start learning the concepts, because learning the concept is key. Definitely key to throwing shows. But for now, this is where we'll end it. This is where we'll stop. So stay tuned for the next part, guys. And I hope you learned something new. I hope you guys are practicing, getting them moves down. Have fun with it. It's about having fun too, right? It's not all about just making the best light show out there. It's about having fun, making it your own flow. Everybody's flow is different. But this is definitely a great key point to keep in mind for any type of glover out there. Everybody should know about grid theory. Anyways, guys, this has been the Night Shadow. Hope you guys liked this video. Stay tuned for next part coming soon, okay? Peace.